Welcome to the second workshop in this session. I'm Alexandra To, and today I'm going to be talking to you about Lab Counterculture. So we're looking kind of specifically at how you might design for diversity, inclusion, equity in the labs that you may go on to lead in academia and even in industry. I think some of these things translate to that context as well. So this is a brief overview of how we're going to spend this next little bit of time. I'm going to introduce myself further and give some more context for where I'm speaking from with this work. We're going to talk about some dark patterns in academia, so it's going to be a little bit of a downer, but then we're going to go into lab counterculture, how you start to resist and design against some of those dark patterns, and then we'll spend a lot of time interacting and brainstorming what your labs are going to look like in the future as you go on to become your own leaders of these spaces. So again, my name is Alexandra To. My PhD is in human-computer interaction. I'm in a kind of an interesting joint interdisciplinary appointment, so I'm 50% in an art and design department with a games program where I teach games user research and game design, and I'm 50% in a college of computer science where I teach HCI. So my research areas are in HCI, games, and racial justice, so some of my research work informs some of this work and vice versa, and a little bit more context about HCI and computer science for those of you who aren't in that field. It's a very fast publishing cycle. It's a field that has severe reliance on advisors for graduate students. So again, I want to make sure that as we're thinking about what I'm sharing, you're also translating to your own context where your fields might operate a little bit differently, but we'll spend some time doing that together today as well. These are some community agreements that are borrowed from some of my work in racial justice organizing. I won't spend time on all of them today, but because there's so much discussion in this session today, I want to make sure I highlight a couple of these. So one is no one knows everything, together we know a lot. So I like to highlight that because, especially in sessions on diversity, equity, inclusion, I think those conversations can feel a little bit sensitive and a little bit difficult. So this is just to highlight that we are obviously all here to learn today and to grow together. So hopefully that you come in with that sort of open mind. And then I like this second one, move up, which is about how you choose to engage with the session. So what that means is, if you are someone who's very comfortable participating and talking a lot, that's great, but you can also move up into a space of listening. And if you're someone who's a little bit quieter, who's a little bit less comfortable sharing and speaking, you might move up into a space of participating and sharing more because we'd love to hear your thoughts. All right, so just because we're short on time, unfortunately, I don't think we have time to do full introductions. Hopefully you all have at least started meeting each other, and I'm happy to chat with folks afterwards. But what would really help me is to hear a little bit more about the disciplines that you all are in, again, as we're thinking about doing some of this translating work. So if folks want to just kind of popcorn out, like what fields are you in, just so I have a sense of the room? Bioengineering. Mechanical engineering. Computer science, all right. What else? What was that? Medicine. All right. Anyone else? All right, I think this is a good starting place. This is very helpful. Thank you. So again, hopefully the things I'm talking about will still be familiar or easily translatable, but you'll have to let me know. All right, so let's talk a little bit about dark patterns in academia. So these dark patterns I'm going to talk about, they're not unique to academia. They exist in other contexts, but I'm going to be talking about them from the perspective of a university environment. And again, they might differ by discipline, so we'll have to do some of that translating work together. So when I'm talking about dark patterns, I'm talking about systems and systemic factors that are harmful to both students and faculty in the academy. So when I say systems, I mean systems as opposed to individuals, right? So the actual structures and incentive systems of academic research and the university as a whole that contribute to sort of harms, right? So what are some of the basic assumptions that we make about students and faculty that are not necessarily true to their circumstances? How do we reproduce some of the inequalities and harms of the sort of broader society that we live in? So I want to be clear, right? We're not talking here about bad people or people who do bad things on their own. We're talking about, again, structures and incentive systems and how you, as an individual, can start to design your own structures and incentive systems. Something I want to highlight here is that we do tend to focus on individual solutions when it comes to some of these issues. So I'll give you an example, right? We know right now that students are facing the highest levels of depression and anxiety in higher education than they ever have. And there's a lot of individual solutions, right? You'll see emails like, here's a free yoga class. And while those resources are great, they do tend to push this narrative of, well, it's your job to make yourself feel better, as opposed to looking at why do students feel this way? How can we make a better system that doesn't contribute to some of these difficult things and these harms? So again, these dark patterns are real in that they have a real impact on the way that we do things, but they are socially constructed and sometimes mythological in that they are not necessary to the functioning of the academy. And again, dark in that they reinforce and reproduce some of the harms and oppressions that already exist. All right, so I'm going to go through a bunch of examples relatively quickly. Again, I hope that they're somewhat unfamiliar to you or that you haven't experienced them that much, but regardless of your experience level with these things, I guarantee you that they exist in your field. So first is focus on quantitative outcomes, right? So there is a sort of push to be constantly churning out research, publications. We measure people based on their citation count. Again, it does not have to be that way. And what this dark pattern does is leave a lot less time for some of that unmeasurable work, work that considers the ethical practices in our lab, the ethical outcomes of our research. Perfectionism and competition go a little bit hand in hand. I'll talk a little bit more about those in a moment. But these essentially set impossible standards, right? They're things that make it difficult to ask for help. And this sense that there are limited resources and that we're in competition for those resources. Again, that does not have to actually be the case. It certainly doesn't have to be the case in your individual lab. Time scarcity is another dark pattern. We tend to reproduce a culture where rest is considered shameful. You have to talk about how busy you are all the time and how much you have going on. I did my undergrad at Stanford University. They have a phrase for that there. It's called Stanford Duck Syndrome, where a duck glides across the water and looks very smooth. And if you look beneath the surface, they're like paddling furiously. And very much it was the culture when I was there to like constantly talk about how hard you were paddling all the time, but like still very California chill. All right, next one is power dynamics. So again, power dynamics exist in almost any environment you're going to come across. Specifically in academia or specifically in my discipline, there is a huge reliance on advisors by graduate students. The advisors hold all the power. They determine almost entirely what your graduate school experience is going to look like by determining what resources you have access to, deciding when you're going to progress through your milestones. This can enable toxic culture within labs where you've got competition between students and power hoarding. And then even amongst faculty, right, there is often this sense that a junior faculty cannot cross a senior faculty, someone who is more well-published or more famous or tenured. And again, that does not have to be the case. There's a status quo bias in the academy. We know, based on sort of existing research in higher education, that faculty tend to choose students who are like them across a variety of metrics, whether that be the way that they do their research or different sort of identity measures. There is also, because of this, a failure to support faculty who are underrepresented in their fields. There are poor retention and poor promotion rates for faculty who do not look like the sort of dominant majority. And the last dark pattern I'll highlight is financial stress. This is rife in the academy, right? I'll take the specific example of conferences, right? Conferences cost thousands of dollars to go to, and we expect students to essentially give labs and universities zero interest loans, right? By paying for flights and registration and waiting weeks, if not months, for reimbursement. And this is just not a comfortable situation for many students, particularly those who come from underrepresented groups. So we'll dive a little bit deeper into perfectionism and competition, like I said. So again, perfectionism sets up these impossible standards. It means that we can't show mistakes, that we avoid failure. It makes it hard for us to ask for help, which we know, again, is not good for the actual work and the research. And this is closely related to this idea of competition, right? This idea that one person's success is another person's failure, or that there are limited resources. What this does is, again, feed into individualism and isolation. It makes it hard for us to form true research communities. And it reinforces, again, those power discrepancies as people hoard power and don't necessarily want to give credit to people with less power in a collaboration because it doesn't look as good on your CV, or maybe you don't want to distribute those authorships in a way that would be actually truly equitable. Okay, so I talked about a lot of difficult things about the academy, right? That we are tapping into these existing social inequities and reproducing them. To go a little bit more specific, where I talked about how financial stress disproportionately harms underrepresented students, students who don't have access to generational wealth. Perfectionism, for example, harms neurodivergent students. I myself am neurodivergent. It's really hard to break some of those habits of not wanting to put out perfect work or for asking for help. But as someone who has a background also in racial justice activism, I want to be clear. I love the academy. Like I chose to keep doing this as my job. I'm an assistant professor. I love mentoring students. And to me, critiquing something and wanting it to be better is the highest compliment you can pay to a system that you reside within, to a group of people that you care about, because I think we can do better. And as I mentioned, right, one of the potentially dark patterns of the academy is that PIs have this disproportionate power, but it also means that you in this room can use that disproportionate power to impact the culture of the academy through your specific labs, because we have so much say over what those spaces look like. So that's where we get into this idea of counterculture. So this work is done in collaboration with Jessica Hammer and Erica Principe Cruz, who are at Carnegie Mellon. Jess Hammer was my PhD advisor, and this is something that we worked on for the entire course of my PhD, and then eventually wrote up this short paper on, which is open access, so you're welcome to check this out afterwards. All right, so let's get into this. So counterculture, more broadly, is this idea of dissent and resistance against dominant ideology. So those dark patterns that we were talking about that are rife in the academy because we continue to perpetuate these things. So how do we actually design lab practices that resist some of these things? So I'll give you two examples from my lab, and then, like I said, we'll spend some time thinking about your own context and what you might want to do. So the first countercultural example I'll give is this idea of celebrating effort over outcomes. This is meant specifically to combat this idea of perfectionism. So two specific things that we do to instantiate this in our labs are, one, we celebrate paper submissions, not paper acceptances, right? We have the ability to celebrate the things that we can control and not the things that we can't control, right? So this means that it doesn't really actually matter in the lab whether or not the paper gets accepted. It's the effort that the student puts in that matters. In a smaller way, you can also do this when it comes to research milestones, right? You can congratulate the completion of imperfect work as a milestone and then frame it in this positive way of like, well, now we can continue to improve this work, and that's really the best outcome we can have. So why does this work? So obviously I don't mean to imply that we can just ignore all of the metrics that affect our real lives, right? Not publishing is not an option for most of us, especially if you go into a tenure track research position. But again, you can't control acceptances, and neither can your students. And it does not help the students to be hyper-focused on that outcome only. It's harmful to their well-being. So instead, having this sort of consistent and genuine celebration of the work that they are doing is much better for fostering a healthy lab culture. And it also means that, again, we're forming a sense of community. I mean this very literally. We have weekly lab meetings, and when someone submits a paper, we actually all actively clap and cheer, because that is the thing that we should celebrate. And when work gets accepted, like, yes, I'm happy about that, but we don't take the time to celebrate that in quite the same way, because that's not actually, a decision someone else made. That's not something that we did as a community. The second one I'll give is a little bit more about resources. So the second countercultural example is providing flexible and accessible resources. So this is meant to combat some of those power dynamics that exist, the status quo bias, and specifically financial stress. So again, two things that our labs do are maintain a flexible lab-wide fund for minor expenses. So again, things like participant costs, software, things like that, that students all have access to. And then a much bigger one is designating a lab credit card for larger expenses like flights and lodging for conference travel. So this is important because it's trying to avoid forcing students into a situation of having to disclose their sensitive statuses to you, financial or otherwise, right? So you don't want to wait until a student says, I can't afford that, or I can't book that flight, or whatever. You want to make sure that every student is aware that this resource is available and that they know the process for initiating asking for that money or asking for access to that credit card. It should be something that's said to every student without making those assumptions about background or resources. It also means structurally, right, we're never requiring that students have some already existing level of financial access to be a successful researcher. All right, so now's the actual good interactive part. Let's talk a little bit about the kinds of labs that you all want to design. Yeah, there's a question? Yeah, I guess what I mean by that is Right, time scarcity is real. What I mean, like all of these dark patterns are real, but it's the way that we treat them and reinforce them that I'm talking about. So again, like I mentioned, time scarcity is more about the culture of rest being shameful, about like when you're in the lab and everyone says, how are you doing? You start listing, here's all the million projects that I'm working on. I think one thing specifically we talked about in the morning session was this idea of like working all the time, right? That like you should be working a 60 or 80-hour week to be a successful PhD student. I worked 40-hour weeks my entire PhD, and I wrote award-winning publications. You do not have to overwork and kill yourself to do a good job in the academy, and that comes from the top down, right? So another example I gave in the morning session is I tell all of my students, I don't answer emails at night or on the weekends, right? Because that time is my time. That is not time for work. And it goes the other way, too. I can't control when a random thought's going to pop into my head for research. I might randomly choose to send an email in the middle of the night before I forget it, but I tell all my students, you do not have to respond to that. If I'm emailing you late at night, it is not your job to be available to me on call 24/7. So that's what I'm talking about a little bit more. One element I did forget to mention, too, is part of time scarcity is the misalignment of incentive systems, right? So if you go into a tenure track faculty position, on paper, you're supposed to spend 50% of your time on research, 40% of your time on teaching, and 10% of your time on service. But when you get evaluated for tenure, you're not really being evaluated for your teaching, right? It's kind of a checkbox that people just make sure you're not doing a disastrously bad job. You're not incentivized to be a good teacher, even though on paper you're supposed to spend 40% of your time doing that. So that's what I mean, is like this misalignment of how we spend our time, what's considered productive, how much time you should be spending to be doing a good job. I think I want to combat that idea that like, to be a good, successful researcher, you have to be spending all of your time doing this. I'll give one more example and then go to your question. I remember when I was a first-year faculty, I went to go speak to a senior faculty because I was about to supervise my first PhD student. And I said, well, how usually do your students split up their time? Like if they're looking at a 40-hour week and they're taking classes, like how much time should they spend on research? And like this like senior faculty looked at me really puzzled and was like, well, if they really care about research, they should be doing it all the time. And I was like, well, that's not reasonable. Like some of my students are parents. Some of them, they have families, they have other lives. No, I don't want them to be doing 80-hour weeks. That's not good for any of us, right? That's not good for anything we're doing. So it was just like combating some of that culture. Yeah, there's a question. I would argue that's true for most fields. Like there is research in higher education on that, right? Like you can only do deep work for so many hours a day, and it's a very small number. It's like 3 or 4, or even 2 for some people, right? And I do want to say, right, like what you choose to do as an individual is entirely up to you, right? If it helps you to like, you know, I have colleagues who work from like midnight to 2 a.m. because that's when they feel most productive. But the important thing to remember is as a PI, as someone who's supervising students, you should not be expecting that of your students. You should be having an open conversation about what the expectations are, and they should not be these unreasonable things, right? And if they choose to work on weekends or they choose to whatever because that's how they want to spend their time, that's different, but you want to check in and make sure that those expectations are reasonable. We are going to move into discussion a little bit, so I want to just move on so we get through the whole program today because we're literally about to move into this. So what I want to do now is give everyone a couple of minutes silently on your own to just think about like what kinds of values you want to uphold in your lab. So we're not moving on to practices yet. We'll talk about practices in a little bit. But just I'm going to put on a 2-minute timer just on a note on your phone or notepad if you have it. Just think about like what actual lab do you want to try to create? And I'll give you some more examples of like prompts for this, right? So if you think about a student who's coming to you who wants to work with you and you're telling them what your lab is about, not just the research, but like what is it like to work in my lab? What are you telling them? What are you telling your new colleagues? What are you telling your dean? What are you telling potential funders? So spend about 2 minutes on your own thinking about this, and then I will let you know to get into small groups to discuss as well. All right, who wants to start first? What values do you all want to design into these labs? What do we got? Yeah.
I love this question because this is what I wrote out and have on my lab website.
Awesome.
So for me, in my lab, creativity, independence, innovation, diversity, inclusivity, and
Oh boy. You might have to slow down for me a little bit there. Give me two more. Creativity, independence.
independence, innovation.
Innovation. Nice. Very nice. All right. Other folks, what are their values? Yeah. Other folks? What about this table? Yeah. Nice, all right. Folks? Let's get a couple more on here. Honesty, that's great. Mentorship. Yeah, I love mentorship because it's the mentorship that we're doing for our students, that our students are doing for the students they're working with. It's great. Oh boy. Belonging. Very nice. Oh boy. Belonging. Yeah. You're staring at a word and you're like, is that a word? Ambition. Impact. We'll put a little plus next to collaboration. Anything else? All right, this is a really great starting list. We were going to brainstorm these, but I think for the sake of time, we're not going to do that. But just to remind you about some of these dark patterns. So what I'm going to ask you to do next is move into practice, right? How do we take these fantastic values that you all came up with and build in specific and concrete practices that your lab will do to uphold some of these values? So what you're going to do, again, those same small groups, is select one or more of those dark patterns, one or more of those values, and think about a specific concrete practice that you can put into your lab that is going to live through those values. So we'll take another 2 or 3 minutes, then again come back into the big group to discuss. Okay, let's hear how have y'all fix the academy in just a couple minutes. All right, what did we come up with? Let's listen up, please. Yeah, that's a good one. I think not doing that, but also communicating that you plan to not do that and what those norms are. That's, yeah. All right, great. So don't email outside of working hours. All right. All right, what else we got? Does that capture that right? So for belonging, we're like sort of popcorn of compliments and appreciation, maybe like, shouting out things that people are doing well. Yeah, that's great. Ah, right. So, not just being kind to your own students, but just in general, right? Making sure it's like clear that like you respect other people's work. Do you have an example of maybe wording you would use for a critique? Yeah. Right, exactly. Yeah. All right. So focus on technical aspects, not like the value of people or what those people are doing or whether or not they're spending their time well. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. Showing vulnerability. I'll add a little asterisk on that of like, obviously with appropriate, boundaries between hierarchies. I know that they're like, it can go hard the other way where you've got advisors who are like emotionally depending on their students. We're talking here about like, yeah, mistakes, being clear about failures, showing that like you can recover from those. I think that's fantastic. Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. Right. So yeah, being transparent with how you spend your time, showing that you go on vacation. I'll even go so far as to say, like, I have a minimum requirement for vacation in my lab because, again, right, as the PIs, we are kind of dictating the culture. So I tell my students, you need to take at least 3 weeks off a year. You can decide when those weeks are going to be. I mean, students might celebrate different holidays. They might have different things going on. So they can choose when to spend that time, but they need to have at least be off a certain amount of time so I know that they're able to take that time off. Let's go one more. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. So it's like, when we're communicating our values, right, like how an individual person might choose to live through those values is kind of up to them, like not being dictatorial about how people choose to spend their time. Yeah, I think that's fantastic. All right. Again, you get to see what other folks said. They had a little bit of like a lab manual, lab bill of rights, clear expectations, things like that. So yeah, let's talk about where you go from here so we can get you guys moving on up to the next debrief. Yeah, so you've already done this. You're already doing it right now. Start early and iterate. I'm constantly altering the language of my lab values and tweaking some of those things. If you're thinking about applying to academic jobs or even to industry jobs, right, this could be the beginning of things like your diversity statements or research statements or cover letters or whatever that might be. And you can bring these back to your current mentorship, right? I'm sure many of you are already working with students, masters and undergrads, or teaching. So you can start, applying some of these values already today. Some other things that you can do if you're, again, no matter where you end up, is starting to look for existing programs and institutions, partners that share your values and who can support your practices. That's, you don't have to start from scratch. There are already people wherever you're going who care about these things, who will be so excited to find faculty who are already thinking about things like equity and inclusion. And the last part here is, starting to think about translating this work back to the academy, right? So I've kind of purposefully mostly avoided talking about the actual outcomes. We talked about it a little bit about, publishing and things like that. But obviously, at the end of the day, there are sort of metrics, invisible or otherwise, that mean that allow us to keep our jobs, allow us to get promotions. So, in your own little home of your lab, you can foster these good values, but then also make sure that you're translating that work back to the academy, right? Showing that, like, yes, by making sure that my students don't work more than 40, 50 hours a week, we're actually still producing a high level of output, and my students are less stressed out maybe than other students are. So starting to think about, again, how do you make sure that you continue to be able to do that by translating what you're doing as being successful. This is a sample of my own work. I heard other lab values and things on a website. This is my lab community agreement. And you'll see right up here, it says this is a living document. So every student who enters my lab, masters, undergrads, PhDs, postdocs, they read this document that tells them what we expect of each other, what they can expect from me. And they're asked to contribute to it. So I asked them to edit the language or to propose things that are missing. So we're all, sort of creating that culture together. It's not something that I'm, again, dictating from the top down. For myself personally, these are just some examples of partners that I found at my institution, just to give you a little bit of inspiration as you're looking at wherever you might be headed next.